Have you ruled out a whole industry because you've heard how difficult it is to get into? Well, that is one of the topics in today's conversation. We're meeting with Joe, who is a journalist, founder and CEO in the media and communications industry. Joe shares with us all about his area of expertise, journalism, his career journey, and he has some great advice for us too. We also talk about diversity, equity and inclusion in the industry, the importance and value of networking, especially in journalism, juggling pursuing your passion with paying the bills, why it's so important to be able to bring your whole self to work in order to do your best work, and of course, the power of persistence. With persistence, you really can access those difficult to enter industries. So if that sounds good to you, wonderful. Joe and I will see you in the show. We hope you enjoy it. Hello, Joe. Welcome to the show. Thanks so much for being here.
Hi, Joe. Good to be here and great to have two Joes in the same room.
Yeah, it is. How about we get started? Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you do, and how long you've been doing it for?
Sure. I'm Joe McGrath. I'm the CEO and founder of Rotic Media. It's a content agency that supplies content, financial content to editorial outlets, but also banks, asset managers, fintechs, anything that's capital markets, personal finance, or fintech related. We're an employer of journalists, trainers, broadcasters, and content strategists.
Wow, thank you. And you're a journalist yourself, right, Joe?
Yeah, so I've been a journalist for, let's have a look, around about 20 years now. I started off on local papers and then went across to financials after that. Been a business journalist ever since. Again, have worked in most of the areas that I described and for some of the well-known companies like Dow Jones, Financial Times, etc.
Brilliant. Thank you. Right. Now, Joe, this is a podcast. So tell us if you're somebody that enjoys podcasts. And if so, what are you listening to right now?
I'll be completely honest with you. I'm not an avid listener to podcasts. I find it really difficult to make the time. But I'm usually the sort of person that's taking part as opposed to the listener. My wife is an avid listener of podcasts in the morning, though. Big fan of anything the BBC produces on current affairs on news. So I sort of listen to it as a third party while she's getting ready in the morning.
Well, I think that's the good thing about podcasts. You can multitask with them. So whether you're getting ready or, I don't know, washing the dishes, you can have it on in the background, which I quite enjoy. So, yeah. All right.
Yeah, I just need to be a bit more organised, I think.
Okay. Well, how about we move on to your area of expertise? There are so many misconceptions about what people do in their working lives, hence this podcast. So how about you tell us the main misconceptions about journalism?
Cool. That's a really good question. I think so. Journalism as a trade has evolved a lot over the last 20 years, certainly from when I was in sort of learning what it was supposed to be, doing work experience. I think my first work experience placement was all the way back in 1995, a now defunct newspaper owned by Rupert Murdoch called Today. Since then, things have moved quite dramatically, and the whole industry's transformed. I was working on a fixed-term contract at the FT during the years where they had all of the digital sites in the .com era being set up at Poultry. I think they had like about 350 employees on all different .com sites, ftyourmoney.com, etc. And then since then, obviously, we've had the sort of maturing of the digital market and the explosion of corporate-owned content as well, which has changed journalism from being something which was on this side of the fence and you had PR on this side of the fence to something where content can be created by organisations with journalists working for those organisations, but the quality is still very, very much the focus. Whereas I think previously Any sort of content that was produced for newspapers or magazines was sort of, oh, well, that's the commercial side and it's not really the journalism. So I think things have changed quite dramatically there. I think within newsrooms themselves, journalists have an awful lot of expectations placed on them now. The market moves much quicker than it ever did before because of social media and how people interact, which means stories develop much quicker than they have previously. And it means that those sort of in junior talent roles who are coming up and coming into the industry need to be equipped with a slightly different skill set to the one which we would have been equipped with back in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s to be ready for dealing with today's market.
Yeah, thank you. So, Joe, what do your friends and family who are outside of the industry think you're doing all day?
I honestly don't know. I've never asked them. I think maybe they've still got a vision of, those sort of 1960s films where you have like a Rain Mac and a little card in your hat. That might well
And
be
a
it.
notepad.
I honestly don't know. Yeah, quite possibly. I mean, I've got pictures of me when I was sort of starting out at a sort of local council function with the shorthand notepad, taking down the notes of the council leader and stuff. But again, it's we do live event coverage now, of course we do. But the sort of day to day is so much more. It's so much more broad. You're doing everything from, you might be looking at what a group of senior policymakers have said on webcasts or podcasts like this. You might be reading regulatory white papers. You might be interviewing someone from a corporate perspective. You might be trying to break a story based on a tip-off or something like that. It's incredibly broad, the skill set now. It's no longer just the silo of, you're training to be a journalist that can produce 300-word news stories, or you're a features writer, or you work on commercial, or you work on editorial. It's so much more broad.
Yeah. All right. So if we had to sum up the purpose of your role in a couple of lines, what do your clients rely on you for?
So I think part of the maturing of the market has resulted in companies deciding how valuable editorial is to them. For some people, that means that they want to spend on quality. So they look at their products and they say, this is an area which we want to invest in because we want to operate in this area, and their value prop has to reflect that. So places like Bloomberg, like Reuters, and on the B2B side, places like With Intelligence, and some of the FT trade publications, they are spending on editorial and investing to make sure that the quality is there. And they're the people that we sort of work with more commonly. But then in the other parts of the market, you've got people who have gone for a sort of volume approach, if you like. And there are room for these different models. And the volume approach are sort of making use of technology like social media to sort of sweep up what you see is being put out there by third parties, other people, and then repurposing that into content that's easy to find for people. We don't do that as part of our model. We're much more in the sort of origination and verification of quality. But as I say, the market is so vast now that you've got to sort of scale almost from the two bits that I described.
Yeah, thank you. Before we get into what you're doing on a day-to-day, Joe, I think it might be helpful if you give us a bit of an overview of the types of roles that sit within an organisation like yours, because as you already mentioned, there are a myriad of roles in this industry now. So it might help the audience understand what kind of roles they might find in a typical organisation like yours.
So we're a content agency, so it's slightly different to a newspaper or a global newswire, and we're smaller for a start.
Yeah.
We've only got 20 heads in the business, so you've got at the sort of in the junior talent areas, you've got the degree apprenticeships, you have paid internships, you have traineeships that we operate. And then you've got sort of juniors who are starting with us who are post-university, but it's their first job or first career job. You also have sort of mid-level talent who maybe have a couple of years under their belt in one or two of our sectors. And then you've got the senior talent, which is the bulk of our business, where they tend to be writers, journalists, broadcasters, or trainers who've been around in the market for 15, 20 years. They are technically exceptionally competent, and they're sort of masters of the sectors that they cover. And then you've got editor-in-chief, who oversees everything that's editorial delivery. You have, on the client side, you have the chief client officer, who's responsible for account management and making sure that everyone is happy with what's being produced on the delivery side. And then you have the marketing function as well, which sort of promotes what we do, how we work, and what we stand for.
Yeah. All right. That's helpful. Thank you very much. Okay, Joe, let's zoom into an average day or week. You've mentioned a couple of things already, but what might we find you doing?
Well, I mean, let's look at this week as an example. Probably looking at the week as a whole is a good way to look at that. So, I mean, my role, I feel very, very lucky that as a founder, I get to have a bit of discretion with which bits that I dig in and out of. Over 5 years, I've become much better at sort of saying to people, you just run with that, do it the way that you think is best. And there's lots of reasons for that. Partly because there are people who are far better qualified in certain areas than I am to go and achieve what needs to be achieved. And partly because you need people with specific focus on the task in hand. And if I was just jumping into everything, giving my two penneth, I think we'd have a series of problems. So I've got my sort of core things that I do during the week, which are sort of management related. But on the journalism side, obviously we've got our own publication, which at the moment we've made quite a bit of noise about that we're looking to launch, which is our own magazine. So there's been a lot of prep work for that, working with writers, both internal and freelancers, internal columnists, the designer, the photographer, to try and get what we want that to look like, and then the web designer to make sure that we've got the wireframe sorted for when that goes live, and getting all the content sort of in the right place for when that goes live. And then also making sure that we are replicating with our titles what we provide for clients. So with Financial Promoter as the new magazine and website, there's been a lot of work going into us going out into industry and making sure we are at events and we have a presence. And I was in Luxembourg earlier this week at the European Asset Management Conference, for instance, with one of the degree apprentices with me. And it's just making sure that we are absorbing what's actually happening in the market. We're not being told a version of it that's being passed to us. So we see it firsthand, and that's what we want to bring to the readership. Then things like today, I've had a photo shoot, lots and lots of meetings with other people in the business, with the editor-in-chief, the chief client officer, with the chief operating officer, just to check over with how things are running. But yeah, it's sort of, I'm really lucky in that I get to do, the majority of my work is sort of strategic in sort of putting a flag in the future as to that's what we're aiming to go for. And then my various colleagues who are other directors in the business go and make that happen the way that they think is best to do so. And then that leaves me to the opportunity to just go and dart off and sort of get involved in things that I think require a bit more attention.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. What about less frequently throughout the year? What might we find you doing? Perhaps extra exciting things or extra challenging things?
Extra exciting things. I guess, I mean, for me, I always wanted to be a journalist. So making that transition to business owner means appreciating that I've spent the last 5 years sort of saying to myself, well, okay, I've spent 2 decades learning how to be a journalist. I now need to learn how to run a business. And founding a business and running a business, two very different things. So I've had to do a lot of upskilling during my time, which again is not really what you perhaps think of as exciting. But actually, a lot of the learning, training, development stuff that I've done on a personal level has been really exciting. I've had to carve out some time to do that. Typically, 2 to 4 days a month, which is a lot. Some of it's personal time, some of it's in Monday to Friday. But that's actually incredibly exciting. I find it really fulfilling. And then sort of, if you're talking about what other people might deem to be exciting, I guess it's wonderful traveling to events, in far off places. Like in the autumn, we were at the Singapore FinTech Festival, and then I had a stop over in Thailand to see a client. And so travel's always great fun. I love traveling, but also working and working with junior talent, where I get to have a hand in training them and passing on things that I've experienced, particularly at live events as well. So I said we were in Luxembourg this week. It was me and one of the degree apprentices. We'll be in Thailand later this year. We're at the Seamless Middle East Summit in May. And it's making sure that the junior talent get to understand, for me, that journalism is much more than stitching together things they might have seen on social media, as important as a skill as that may be for some types of journalists. For us, I don't want people to lose the skill set of being able to capture something that's happening in front of them, being able to interview someone in the moment, being able to accurately distill the facts of a discussion that's happening or a series of events that are playing out live. And I think if we lose those skills as an industry, then journalism will be in a tricky situation, whether that's on the editorial side or on the commercial side, because it's particularly in the age of digitalization and automation. I think that they are the skills which humans bring, which can't be served by aggregators because that information isn't out in the public domain yet.
Yeah, absolutely. Just on that, one of our previous guests talked about a really nice concept that was, thought leadership versus thought recycling. And it sounds as though that kind of just collating other people's ideas almost fits into that thought recycling bucket. And I guess in this very competitive landscape, you've got to find a way to differentiate. And that is the being there on the front line, having the story, right?
Yeah, and it's the same for journalism as well. Like I worked with a terrific editor when I was at Financial News, a guy called Gren Manuel, and he made the newsroom appreciate the difference between something which was a news atom and something which was an umbrella theme. And it's about not seeing a news atom and then just reporting every single thing you see. It's gathering together all these individual pieces of information, which in their own right are vaguely interesting. But when you see something playing out in Frankfurt, in London, in New York, in Singapore, in Luxembourg, and you put all those together, you're like, hang on, this is something which is manifestly changing the landscape of a market. That's a big story. And that takes a skill set of researching, speaking to people, understanding the why. And repurposing information that's already out there doesn't necessarily give you the why, particularly when it's an emerging theme. So thought leadership, in my view, on the commercial side, is certainly being able to articulate and identify those themes which are emerging, and then the relevance to your buyer or your market. But on the journalism side as well, it's what they call the if you're writing a news story, it's what they refer to as the nut graph. The why should the reader care? And it's being able to gather up enough information to make the note that this isn't just a one-off. This is something which is going to affect change for some time to come, and you need to be aware of it, and here's why. So it's a long-winded way of answering your question, but yes, I see the point that you're making.
Yeah. All right. And what about the challenging things that happen throughout the year?
Well, there's been plenty of those. So I think this is the other thing you don't appreciate when you're working as a journalist. And I've interviewed probably hundreds of CEOs in my life, and interviewing CEOs does not prepare you for being a CEO. And I think it doesn't prepare you equally for you're reading statistics as a journalist. You're talking to people. and you're trying to get as much of an insight and as a feel for what's happening in a market from everything around you, but it is not happening to you. You're sort of looking in almost. When you're running a company, you feel stuff changing because you're sitting in the seat and you're like, oh, that's changed, that's happened. And what we've seen happen over the last year is because of what's happened with the political environment, certainly within the UK, multiple changes of leadership and strategy. What's happened on the global scale with the war in Ukraine, supply chain issues. There's various different macroeconomic and geopolitical themes we could discuss, but they have rumbled through to businesses working in the UK. And although, if you look statistically, it's said that we're not in a technical recession, I think you speak to enough SMEs and business owners, and you will certainly see that we've certainly had to be much smarter with how we use our resources. We've had to make some difficult decisions. It's keeping a very close eye on what's happening within the business, but also what's happening outside of the business with every stakeholder, not just clients and prospects. And so it's been, I'd say it's been a challenging period of probably 9 months, but also it's one where we've probably learned the most. And certainly a lot of the activity that we're doing on the marketing side now would never have manifested had we not have gone through this period. Because we've learned the power of marketing. The stuff that we've been doing for other people for the past 5 years, we're finally doing for ourselves. And I can honestly say, hand on heart, it's like, when you speak to a fund manager and you say you invested in your own fund, we're taking our own medicine because we believe it's going to make us better. And sure enough, the statistics are showing us that it is working. So I'm pleased to say that what we tell other people we can deliver does actually work, or certainly it's working for us anyway.
Well, that's good to hear. Thank you. Joe, what do you love most about your job?
It's the variety. I think there's so many opportunities to do things differently to the status quo. And I think a big subset of that variety is the work I get to do with junior talent. So we have someone in our editorial team, John, who looks after editorial development within the business. But a lot of these initiatives strategically are drawn up at board level, where we discuss where we're going to invest, because obviously there is a resource commitment. And being able to have a handle on developing people coming into the market and ensuring that there are the widest possible number of entry points to get people into our market really matters to me. And I can bore you with my story of getting into industry if you'd like, but let's just say for some people it's a tough route in, and I think that's only become more so if you look at statistics from people like the Scott Trust, etc., over the past sort of 20 years. And we're now, if you look at various areas of representation, whether you're looking at class or you're looking at gender, ethnicity, any of the metrics on D, E, and I, it doesn't feel like we're really moving the needle that quickly. And I think for me, it matters that we're trying to do all we can to improve representation, and having the ability to be sitting in the chair where you set up that strategy and you direct it. That's worth all the sleepless nights about challenges that the business might face, because when it does work, you're setting someone up for a fantastic career.
Yeah, thank you. And what do you love most about being a journalist?
What do I love most about being a journalist? I think this has changed over the past 20 years. So when I first started, it was about being able to give people to amplify their voice. So those who were underrepresented or didn't have access to, or couldn't get the ear of people in decision-making roles or capacities, being able to be that conduit where you could phone up and have a point of access and say, look, this person's been unfairly treated. What have you got to say for yourself to explain yourself? Of course, things move on, and social media has enabled more people to do that. Digital interfaces have allowed for better feedback mechanisms. And I think today, if we sort of fast forward to where we are now, I think I far more enjoy the sort of collaborative working with businesses where you can sort of talk to them about problems and pain points that are happening either in their market or looking from a global macroeconomic or geopolitical spectrum and saying, look, how are you going to respond to this to make sure that your customers and your stakeholders are okay? And I think the movement we've seen on ESG, for instance, and sustainability more broadly, is a mirror to that, because organizations are aware that they have to do more now. There is just an expectation that if they want clients, whether that's B2C or B2B, they have to be invested in that genuinely and not just paying lip service to it. And again, you go back 20 years, and despite the messages that you've seen out in the market, I just don't think that was the same case, even though there were sort of CSR programs at the time.
Yeah, thank you. And what are the main? We've talked about some of the challenges of the last year or so as being a founder and CEO. What would you say somebody who's interested in journalism as a career might find challenging about journalism work?
I think the hardest thing to get across to people when they start now is that while you've got greater access to information perhaps than you've ever had before, because the digital landscape has done us a lot of favours on that, you still need a network, and that means meeting with people, finding people who will support you, finding people that think the same way you do, and also finding those who think opposite to you. So you won't always agree on everything. Your approaches might be entirely different, but you need to have met each other, understood each other's point of view, because at some point your paths will cross and there will be an opportunity for you to collaborate. And it's something that I say particularly to junior talent when, I don't know, they might be working on a story where that doesn't serve anyone's marketing objectives. On the editorial side, we get bookings for editors have commissioned us to do an independent piece on whatever. And every press officer is like, well, there's not really an incentive for us to be involved in this at the moment. It doesn't drive any of our marketing, doesn't tick any of our marketing boxes, or it's not target media, so we're not going to put you to the priority list of giving you access. If you haven't got a contact book, that piece suddenly becomes very, very difficult to write. So you need to have spent time cultivating a network, understanding what people know about, what they don't know about, what they say they know about, but actually they don't. And then it makes it much easier if you get someone saying, okay, here's a brief, I'd like you to turn that round. It's on a topic that not many people know about, and even fewer are going to want to speak to you about it. If you've got that network where you can just say, look, I know this is not going to do you tick any of your marketing boxes, but I really need you to help me out. They'll help you out because that relationship has endured.
Yeah, thank you. Now, when people hear the word networking, they can often feel scared about it. So I wonder if you have any top tips for people who feel nervous or scared about networking.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember the first time I was told to go to a networking event in the city, and I had an incredibly ill-fitting suit. I sort of walked into a room of people who were far older, far better connected, far wealthier than me. It was incredibly daunting, and I remember sort of walking through this I don't know what you call it, sort of it was a gentleman's club. That sounds like something completely different, but a sort of typical City of London exclusively men, sort of your private members club. And the sort of, you walk through these big oak doors, and someone was standing there with a tray of drinks, and I took my tray of, didn't take the tray, took one drink even back then, and sort of went to the sort of corner of the room and looked around and was like, how am I going to get involved in talking to any of these people? I've got nothing in common, yet my editor sent me here to go and network and get something from it. I eventually threw myself in and got talking to people. I think what I'd say to people that are looking to start from scratch is look for the easy ways to begin with. That is not the sort of environment that most people would want to go and do as their first networking event. Don't fill yourself with intimidation by going to that as your first one. Have a look at things like events and conferences that are open access, where if it's an industry that you want to get involved in, go along to those where people are on stands and they're at these conferences. They're deliberately there to speak to you. They are on stands because they want to speak to you. So just go up and say, hi, I'm here for whatever purpose. Can we have a chat? and
Yeah.
they'll be happy to talk to you because that's why they're there. Similarly, there'll be groups and networks and communities where you can meet like-minded people who also feel the same way. I mean, I know Apex Group are just launching the Women's Accelerator Network at the moment, and that's a perfect example of, there may be people who are interested in career advancement but don't necessarily have the confidence to speak to other people in their sector about how they can share knowledge, skills, etc. And going to those sorts of networks or initiatives will really help, because you'll find there's lots of people that feel the same way as you. And it's not just within representative groups. There are organisations that are sector-wide as well. So have a hunt around. That's what I'd say.
Yeah, that's great advice. And you could even start with something that's completely outside of your career interests. Maybe, I don't know, go on meetup.com and find I don't know, let's say you're into reading, find a group that meets about reading. And that could be a really easy entry point, couldn't it? To just practice talking to people you don't know in an unfamiliar environment.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so many different, if you just go on to, I don't know, as you say, it doesn't have to be sector related. You go on to the Excel Centre's diary of events, you can find a big list of things that are going on with free entry. You just got to register, get your free ticket, have a wander around, have a chat to people.
Yeah.
They're there to network. So it's a great place to go and try it out. But if it all doesn't go to plan, it doesn't matter. No one cares.
Yeah. You never see them again.
No, exactly. It really doesn't matter.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Joe, when you look back at the work you've been doing over the past 20 or so years, what are you most proud of?
I think probably some of the stories that I've written. Again, when I was allowed to just be editorially focused on the readership, the publications which were where you were reminded that you were subscription based, and so there are a set of rules attached to that, probably made me far more hard-nosed as a journalist than perhaps, or without a doubt, than I am now with the commercial stuff that I do, because the people ultimately that you were told to keep in mind were the readership as opposed to the advertisers. And it's very, very different for lots of reasons now. But it did mean that you could go after stories in a certain way, where you could be, I think it's the FT that have the slogan "without fear or favour." And it really was that. You could just go after it and say, well, my remit here is to serve the reader. And if that was, a fund manager that was not just not performing, but was losing everyone their money, as was the case in one instance, then you really go to town on trying to get that person to be held to account. And similarly, the issue of remuneration, again, it's been in the zeitgeist now for some time. But I remember talking about sort of bank and building society director pay post-crisis, and we're still talking about it today. But there were some good analysis pieces as well as the sort of interview-based ones, which I'm quite proud of. But I've written too many stories to be able to remember individual ones, I think. After a while, they just become the next one and the next one.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Well, I'm thinking about the Netflix documentary I watched recently about the Wirecard scandal, and I can imagine it's that feeling of, wow, I broke this story, and now the person's being held to account, and the customers who were treated badly, will hopefully be compensated. So I'm imagining it's that kind of feeling.
Yeah, there were a couple of moments in my life where you write a story and at the time, because you're in it, you don't realise quite what the magnitude and impact is going to be. And something I've tried to teach to junior talent now is that always remember that when you press publish, there's a consequence to you publishing that story. Think about what impact that's going to have on the other person, the other people, the companies, the other companies in that market. When stories move share prices, that there are implications for investors. You're not just operating, I'm writing something and no one will ever read it. When you write something, I remember sending out an agency-wide email when the the Ukraine war, I think, wasn't quite kicking off. It was about to get started, and obviously everyone didn't know whether or not it was definitely on. There were sort of troops amassed on the border, but a lot of the investment commentaries at the time were making predictions, stroke assumptions about what might happen. And I just sent a note round to everyone saying, remember that there are implications. You might write something completely innocently because you've seen it on social media and then you just say it. But if you haven't verified it and you haven't stood it up and you haven't got first-hand justification for what it is that you've written, you could do a lot of damage by just putting that out there. And that's the extreme end. But I remember covering the financial crisis when I was covering a part of the European lending market where people like Lehman Brothers were backing it, and I remember sitting there with my colleague across the desk, and we were seeing lenders pull out the market on the mortgage side. And we didn't understand why suddenly the PRs on the other side were saying, I'm sorry, we can't talk to you anymore. You have to go through New York. And we took it as a personal, oh, hang on, why won't they speak to us? They've always spoken to us. There was something bigger above our pay grade going on, which perhaps we hadn't appreciated at that time. And obviously looking back now, you look at the stories that we were writing, and it was an absolute clear breadcrumb trail to what was happening in the lead up. But we were in it at the time, and I would say arguably too junior to appreciate exactly the magnitude of where we were heading.
Yeah. Oh, thank you very much. Okay, Joe, let's go back to the beginning. When you were young at school, what did you want to be when you grew up?
I'm really lucky. I'm one of those weird people. I always wanted to be a journalist. My mum's got a recording of me on a VHS tape at the age of 11. They did like these school interviews when you left primary school, saying, what do you want to be? And I want to be a journalist.
I love that.
And I think the only difference was that in my early sort of teens, I wanted to do be a sort of war correspondent and report on conflict. And as I got a bit more mature, I started to understand that my level of political understanding or my ability to observe how strategy was playing out on the ground was probably not where it needed to be. And then obviously I started to think about things like what happens as you get older. Do you want to be away from your family and such like? So I chose business, which was always something that I was also interested in. And it just meant that I was lucky in that when I started sort of talking about work experience at school, I was quite insistent that I wanted to go to a known entity. And so I started writing for work experience with sort of the international news media or national news media, as was then, probably from about the age of 12, 13, which meant that by the time I got to the age of 15, I'd managed to find who the right person was. And I said, can I have these days? And they said, yes. And there's a whole story there we could talk about. But it certainly set me on the right trajectory, because once I'd been in a newsroom, that was it. There was never going to be another job for me.
Yeah. And I guess two questions. What inspired you to think, journalism is the career for me? And also, who were you talking to at the time about that as an option?
Well, I can tell you that I was the first person in my immediate family to go to university. So there was no one who was involved in media, let alone journalism. I had nobody at school who was directing me. I just liked newspapers. I was given the responsibility, I think, in my last year of primary school to look after the news wall. So I used to put a different masthead up of the paper I'd cut out and arrange the stories I thought were the most important, and then write little pieces to what the summary was. And just things like I enjoyed doing that. I enjoyed collating research bits together, like research packs for history and stuff like that. And I think I remember, again, this is last year primary school, as I talk through it, it's beginning to come clear to me that was actually quite a formative year. We got taken to a supermarket. I think it was a Tesco locally on a school trip, and it was a big, one of these big hypermarket type things. And we had to put together a report based on what we'd learned that day. And they used to back then have little leaflets on all the counters explaining what was on offer and recipe tips and things like that. I came back with this big, armful of all this stuff. I just loved gathering it together and going, here's what they're doing on the bakery at the moment, here's what they're doing on the
Yeah.
deli at the moment. And it was basically putting together research for a sort of consumery type magazine. I mean, it was nothing like that sophisticated when I wrote it up, of course, because I was, 10, 11 years old. But I loved it. And I was just like, this is what I want to do. I love the research. I love the talking to people. I love the writing it up. I love the collating. And then I loved the feedback as well. So when I got my grade and the teacher said it was a good piece, it was like, that felt really good. And then obviously, as I got a bit older, I started getting interested in consumer affairs and representing the people who were underrepresented. And it just kind of went from there. I can't honestly say, hand on heart, I had anyone saying, go and be a journalist over there because, or here's how you become a journalist. It was very much finding my own way. And that
Yeah.
was a theme that persisted until I got to, even till I got to the end of university, I'd say.
All right. So tell us about that work experience story.
It's why I think work experience is so important. At the age of 15, October 1995, just before Today newspaper closed, didn't know that at the time. I think it was about 4 weeks before it closed. I turned up at Wapping on the first week, and HR came to meet me. Hello, Joe. Right, we're going to walk you across here, across the road, across Admiral House to Fortress Wapping. You've got your badge. I was like, oh, look, it's a badge. It says News International. This is great. Saw all the brands on the, I was from Bristol. I didn't know. And so I came across the road and saw like the big London, the presses then used to roll underneath the building. And I got shown up to, I think it's the 5th or 6th floor in the corner where the newsroom was for Today. And they opened the double doors and I was like, wow, this is incredible. All the desks, there were people running around. Back then you had like packages coming up from imaging, you had the picture desk research, there were messengers running about with different things. I got given a pager and told you're going to be on the messenger desk. And that was it. I spent the next week running up and down, doing things for various journalists. I don't, looking back now, I think there were journalists on the newsroom like, Mary Riddell, who obviously is incredibly well thought of now. But at the time, I didn't know who these people were. I was just like, these are very impressive. I was 15. I just loved the job. And, it was an honour to run to the West End to get them something from a bookshop,
Yeah.
I just loved it. I loved the fact that I was a part of the cycle, even though there was no bylines for me as a lowly messenger. I remember, I can't remember if it was that placement or it was one subsequent to that, because I did go back. But one of the things they allowed me to do was shadow a sports reporter. And it was when Chelsea had Glenn Hoddle as their manager, and they were signing Dan Petrescu, and there was a big press conference. And it was the first time that I got to understand that news wasn't handed to someone. So there was the official press conference, which our journalist had gone to, but I saw a huge, wasn't quite a fight, but it was a very angry exchange going on to the left of the press conference. And it was a PR team for the football club shouting at a journalist from one of the other newspapers and telling them they have to leave the training ground immediately, and security were marching them off. And I said to my journalist that I was with, what's happened there? He said, well, we have to go to the pub afterwards because they were the same stable. I was like, why is that? He said, because he won't have a story and I need to give him some of my notes. Otherwise, he's going to get into trouble. We go to the pub and he just explains to me, he asked the question, why were you kicked off the training ground? And this journalist from one of the tabloids had been going to ask the youth players whether they've ever been offered performance-enhancing drugs. And he got caught doing that. And as a result, was marched off. And so the journalist I was with was showing him the notes from the official press conference, but this guy was explaining the leads that he had that had led him to answer those questions. And it was just really eye-opening. Again, for someone who's interested in how the industry mechanics actually work, it was totally different to what I'd read in the textbooks. And it was a revelation. I just loved it from the off.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. And I've got to ask, how did you secure that work experience?
So originally I wrote to the editor who is now deceased, actually, but very well thought of on Fleet Street, Richard Stott. And then I got passed to his managing editor, I think, initially. We exchanged a couple of times, as just a kid writing in and asking stuff. And then eventually got referred to HR. And this took like 5 or 6 letters of keep writing back and annoying and pestering. a couple of phone calls. And then eventually I got passed to HR, and they were like, okay, this is what we need to have in order to get the work experience.
Yeah.
And then I got the provisional date sorted and took that back to my school and said, this is where I want to go. It went from there.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great lesson, isn't it, for anybody who is thinking anything's going to be handed to them on a plate. You do have to go out there and get it. And if that means writing 100 letters to get the experience you're so looking for, then, sometimes you've just got to do that. Yeah.
That's so true. And it's not just with work experience. I think when I came out of university, I must have written at least 100 letters for jobs. I think I got about 4 interviews. I didn't get any of them. It's why I had to go back and do my postgraduate qualification and get the NCTJ, because at the time that was the entry standard. But I didn't know that. Don't be disheartened, and try to juggle the financial headache that can come with that sometimes, because you need to earn money, but if you're not in the job that you enjoy, then that's going to be quite taxing, because the rest of your life you're going to be working in that. It's worth it. 100% it's worth it.
Yeah. So you now know what you want to do, and you've done your work experience. How does that shape your educational choices for A-level and university and so on?
Well, how ranty do I want to get about this? I think I picked the subjects originally that I knew I was going to score well at, which was a bad decision. So my A-level choices at 16 were music, German, and English. Media, music, and German. I'd never done media before, but was comfortable that I really want to get into this. So I'm going to be really in it. I'd scored well at history at GCSE, thought they were related. Music, I'd played piano, since I was a kid, and sort of thought, okay, well, that's not a massive stretch to take that on. And German was one of my highest scoring grades at GCSE, and I thought it'd be useful if I ever became a foreign correspondent. I got to the end of my first year. They didn't have A1s and A2s or AS levels as they are now. It was just first year of A level, and if you left at that point, you got nothing. So I dropped music at the end of year 1, and then did a 2-year A level in English at the end of year 1, and did that within a year. Took shorthand at the same time, and then that was very clear. I wanted to be a journalist in my mind. Media, English, shorthand, foreign language equals journalist. What I didn't realise was the choice that I was going to make next was going to either make my life incredibly difficult or incredibly easy, and I made the wrong choice. Because no one explained to me in the career service of the college that I was at the time, as great as it was for the education side, the career service that came with it and at school didn't understand the importance of spelling out the difference of how London-based media employers looked at the university that you went to and the subject that you studied. So I ended up doing a degree in corporate communication, which has turned out to be incredibly useful now. But at the time, everyone was like, what's this? That's not English at Durham. And as a result, I found it very, very difficult to explain that, actually I'm very capable. Yes, I did study at Southampton Institute, as was. But I chose these, I made these choices. It wasn't because I flunked my grades. I chose the pathway that I did because I thought it would be a varied course. I didn't know that was going to have a bearing on my career for the rest of my life. And turns out that it did. So I had to make a few adjustments along the way to get back on track. But it's also one of the reasons that I'm very keen on degree apprenticeships now, because I think, it's a way of writing that and making sure that access is truly available to as many people as possible.
And you mentioned you took the wrong path. What would have been the right path in those London organisations' eyes?
So there were a number of graduate programs, which I started applying to at the end of my second year of university. And I was told the parameters of them were, in some cases, as strict as Oxford, Cambridge, Bristol or Durham at that time. I think some of the newspapers had loosened their criteria. to include red brick or I think it was just red brick universities at that point. Certainly Russell Group. But if it wasn't on that list, forget it. Then they're not really going to take you seriously. And similarly, if you didn't have a first from a university that wasn't Russell Group, forget it, because you're doing an easy degree. So, if you can't get a first in an easy degree, we don't want to talk to you. It was remarkable because people were hiring in their own image. And it was I don't know, a mechanism that served them well for many, many years. So, I mean, times change, right? It was just a stage of evolution. But I think we still got an awful lot of discussion to have around recruitment practices even today, because if you look at the representation statistics, particularly on things like social background, which I'm really keen to sort of talk about on a regular basis, it's still the statistics are still really poor. I think certain people from certain backgrounds are still really badly represented in our sector. I think I might get the statistic wrong. It's as low as like 7%. If you're the first person to go to university and your parents work for a professional background, I mean, it's ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah. Wow, that's I'm from a HR and recruiting background, and I just I've always tried to work against this model. But if you think about a recruitment funnel, you have a broad number of candidates at the top, and then to the one candidate you're going to hire. And I think that what happens with these, especially these graduate schemes, it's like, okay, anyone that didn't get a first, they're out. Anyone that didn't go to these unis, they're out. Anyone that didn't do this subject, they're out. Anyone who hasn't had an internship in one of our competitors, they're out. Okay, we've got 6 people we can interview. But like you say, the likelihood is those 6 people are going to be the same type of people as the people doing the hiring. So it's I think that's what worries me about algorithms in hiring processes, because your algorithm can do all that work for you. So the person looking at the applications never even gets to see the amazing candidate from, whichever university or not, as the case may be, who didn't do a certain course. So, I feel very passionate about that too.
I think it's processes that screen out candidates. Okay, I get why they're there, because it's about efficiency. But you're talking about people here, and if you're truly committed to enabling diversity and being a part of change in any sort of meaningful way, you have to accept as an employer, we're going to spend a bit more on this, and that's a bit more time. That is, we appreciate that in taking this risk to broaden it, there might be more failures. Also, the flip side of that is that someone who didn't get a first or didn't get straight A's might have had incredible learning velocity because they were dealing with ridiculously difficult circumstances at home, and yet still achieve straight B's or a 2-1. And these sort of nuances aren't captured with numbers on a grid or even 2-minute conversations. You need to accept that if you're going to do this right, it's an investment. And if you truly are committed to a culture that's going to be welcoming to everybody, just the best people, then sometimes there are going to be a few potholes that you're just going to have to get over in order to achieve that. But you'll be better off culturally and more rich as an employer. And you should perform better as an organisation too, if you go through that process, I believe, personally.
Yeah, me too. Okay, so you finish uni. What happens next?
What happens next? I don't get a job. I mean, I do get a job, but not in the job I want. So no one will hire me as a journalist because I didn't have the right qualifications. I've done loads of work experience, by the way, but it doesn't count for anything. At this time, I've been working for a year and a half at the Financial Times in different parts of the building. No one will hire me. It doesn't matter because you've got a degree from Southampton Institute. I can tell you who all the media owners are. I can tell you the readership profile of every national newspaper. I probably know as much as I could know at that point about the industry of B2B journalism. They're not interested. Even, that's sort of where the starting point is. So I go, all right, I'm not going to get in that way. So what am I going to do? Well, I need to get some work experience in the market, so I start working in advertising. I'd sold, because I knew I wanted to be a journalist from a young age, I'd sold classified advertising from the age of 16, evenings and weekends at my local paper before I went to university. I'd done work experience and worked in other parts of the building as a temp in the FT during my university experience. So I'm like, okay, I just need to keep gathering the media experience. And I went to sell advertising, selling display advertising for a customer magazine for the Heathrow and Gatwick Express. I then got headhunted after a year to go and sell advertising for a magazine at The Independent. Again, kept saying, can I go and have a conversation with editorial? And I remember the publisher saying to me, it's very unusual for journalists, for salespeople to want to go and be journalists. It's usually the other way around. People want to come and earn money. I was like, that's what I want to do. And everyone was telling me it would be a pay cut, it will be a pay cut, it will be a pay cut. And in the end, I couldn't make the transition internally. So in 2003, I made the decision that I would throw in the job that I had, take out a credit card, thank you HSBC, who lent me, I think, $3,500, or gave me a credit limit of $3,500, which allowed me to go and buy a course at Harlow College to do my postgraduate NCTJ, and to pay for my travel and food and drink for that period of time. And then I got a job working in the local NHS PCT doing admin while I was studying. And then eventually got a placement on the local paper where I took a job for 33% of what I was earning before, after having done 6 months free work experience and working 2 other jobs in order to do the free work experience to get in. But I got in, and once I was in, that was it. The doors fly open.
Yeah. What is an NCTJ?
So it's like at the time it was the industry standard qualification for journalists wanting to work on a local paper, particularly. But because so many of the national journalists had come up that way, if you had the NCTJ, it'd be like, oh, you know how to structure a story, you know your media law, you know your public affairs, you've probably got shorthand, you know, all of these things that just it's a shortcut for the explanation. And now I understood why I wasn't getting in, because people who had that were just jumping.
They were out. People who didn't have it were out of the funnel. And what does it stand for?
The NCTJ? National Council for the Training of Journalists.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Got it. Okay. So now you're at the local newspaper. You're in. Tell us about what happens next.
So I don't last very long. I do a year. I get on really well with my editor. Initially, it's a man called Graham. Later, a lovely lady called Paula, who was great at coaching the junior talent in the room, myself included. I just work really hard on my local beat, but I'm getting paid $10,500 a year at that point. And I can't afford to live. I've got to pay the rent. I can't afford petrol. I frequently run out of petrol on the way to work, because I'm looking at the tank going, I can't afford to buy it yet. You know, I'm overdrawn. I have a billy can in the back because I know that sometimes when I'm going down the 127, I'm going to run out and I'll have to walk back to Tesco because that's the risk I'm taking. But that's how much I'm paid. And in order to get on later in my career, I'm going to have to do it. I supplement that job by working in nightclubs of an evening, and doing bar work, and then doing a bit of admin, sort of doing presentations for banks in the City of London, temp jobs, that sort of thing, when they're available. Much to the frustration of my editor, who's like, why can't you cover evening council meetings? It's because I'm paid $10,500 a year. Sorry. And those arguments became sort of more frequent. I was like, well, if you can't pay me anymore and you want me to do that, then I need to find another job. So I end up applying to the FT on their trade titles and getting a fantastic job with Financial Advisor, which is now part of FT Advisor.
I'm really curious. You've now been in for a couple of years. You know, what are the things that are going on that are making you feel, I know I'm in the right place. You know, I know that going back to college was worth it. You know, what's it looking and feeling like for you?
I'm incredibly proud of the job I'm doing. I think that's it has meaning, and I guess part of working so hard to get into an industry means that you really treasure it and you value it and you take it incredibly seriously. So while there are other people who may have just not had the pathway I had, um, they might just sort of, I don't know, 80% it, or they do the work, but it's, oh, I've done the work and off I go now. I'd frequently work to 11 at night. I'd frequently been in incredibly early. Um, just this pride of getting into an industry that I worked so hard to get in, and really wanting to prove to whoever the employer is that I'm worthy of promotion to the next thing.
Yeah.
And I guess as a consequence of that, I was probably, well, I don't think there's any probably about it, I was incredibly chippy, because I was almost prickly that there were people around me who didn't understand how seriously I was taking this opportunity I'd been given.
Yeah. Yeah. So now you're at the Financial News. So tell us about your journey there.
Yeah, so I'm a financial advisor at this time, so as part of the
Financial
FT.
advisor.
So it's one of the trade magazines that was in a different building to where I worked as a temp at the main newspaper. So it didn't have the sort of feel and the prestige of being at Southwark Bridge as was. It was in this place in Tabernacle Court, which was sort of housed all the trade titans. But I was getting regular bylines. The pace was incredible. You got to meet so many contacts. You got to go to places which, for what was I, 24 at that point? For a 24-year-old to be going to some of these places, just incredible. Meeting people I never thought I'd ever get the chance to see. I think I can't remember that during that period of working on the trades, not just there, but subsequently, I remember being in a room with like Gordon Brown and senior Treasury ministers, and the access for someone in their 20s to those people. It's it's something that for me I took very, very seriously, and perhaps look in hindsight a bit too much so. I just wanted to be very, very good and make sure that I was worthy of being there.
Yeah. And how long were you with that organisation for?
So I wasn't there that long. Again, the other thing with this is once I was in, I was ambitious and I wanted to improve my earnings. And the quickest way to do that, I found, was to hop around a lot. Because if you go to someone saying, I want a pay rise, they're like, well, you've only been here 5 minutes. It's like, yeah, but you've started me on a really small amount of money. And that was the case in media back then. We're still going back quite a way now. But yeah, so I was there probably about a year and a half, of which I'd say about a year was with Financial Advisor, probably slightly less. And then I went to the overseas syndication desk within the same group in the FT, but it was rewriting copy that had been written for the main paper for distribution to newspapers and magazines and newswires all around the world. So, for instance, if there was a piece that was about, I don't know, something happening with the Irish government, it would be rewritten to a syndication client in Dublin in a way that would be written very different to how a London audience would read it. So you had responsibility for that. And that was great. But again, I needed more money. And money was the theme that persisted through this, because I was still very, very poor, carrying a lot of debt. And if people weren't able to pay me more, I was like, okay, I need to see where the opportunity is. Where's the next financial reward? And so I think I left there after about a year and a half in total.
Yeah. And I think just on the financials, what I've recognised over the years is that, and it might be across all industries, but I certainly have noticed it in popular industries where, and not so much these days, I don't think, but, you're expected to do work experience for free, or an internship for free, or you're started on a very low salary, almost because you should be grateful to be able to work in media, fashion, those kinds of industries. But I think what tends to happen, and this is something that I personally struggled with, I didn't live in central London. Therefore, for me to be able to work for free, it was impossible. Therefore, I kind of ruled any of those industries out before I started, because I knew that it wasn't going to be possible for me to work for free. You know, had I lived in central London, that might have been a bit easier, or had I had the family wealth to support me, that might have been a bit easier. But I think it's funny how certain industries you almost expected to be grateful for the opportunity. So I suppose it's classic supply and demand, isn't it? Actually, now I'm talking about it, popular industry, more supply of people.
I mean, yes and no, but I think you're excluding people again if you're insisting that they work for free. And look, as a business owner, I get it. It's hard to justify the resource spend sometimes because you want to do the right thing. But equally, if you're expecting people to work for free, if they're not from a wealthy background or they've got access to a pot of cash, they're probably borrowing to work for you. So they are paying you and they're doing your work. And that was what I did to get in. For 6 months, I worked 1 day a week for free, where I was putting parking on my credit card. I was putting my food and drink on my credit card, just so I could get into an industry for, I think it was a FTSE 100 employer at the time.
Yeah. All right. So what happens after the syndication desk?
So I get a job at what became probably, I still to this day, probably one of my favourite jobs I've ever done. It was my first editorship, and it was a little SME publisher, hugely entrepreneurial, but they couldn't afford an editor with loads of experience, so they looked for potential, and they got me, and I loved it. It was covering the specialist mortgage market. It was a company called Niche News and Publishing, which was founded by a guy called Ed Takas, who's also now deceased. But he really taught me a lot, not just about using junior talent well, and that it's not just a case of juniors can't do things. Actually, if you give them some boundaries and some coaching, as was the case with my boss Kevin Rose, it means that you can really develop very, very quickly, and that's what happened. And I was hired on a modest salary to look after what was a quarterly that they wanted to take bi-monthly. And by the time I left 2 and a bit years later, it was a monthly title, which was bringing in really good amounts of revenue. It had a series of events attached to it. It had a website that was putting out 2 newsletters a day. And it had a reputation in the market for being something of a no-nonsense B2B title that broke stories first, and it broke stories ahead of companies which were bigger and titles that were more established. And I was incredibly proud of that. And I'd never worked so hard in my life. Like that was probably the period where I would be out networking, lunchtime. I would go to an awards do in the evening. I would hang about at the end to find out what the stories were, what was going on. I would, sometimes I would sleep on the Circle Line and go back to the office the next day at 6 o'clock. Don't recommend it. I don't think you can anymore. I think it stops one way. But go back in the office, grab an hour on the floor, and then start typing up the stories from the night before, putting in the calls that you were out first with the news. And you can do it in your 20s, can't you? It was just wonderful, absolutely wonderful. I loved it, and it was everything I thought a job could, should and could be. And it's something that I talk very fondly about, as you can see now with my colleagues today when they're coming into the industry, about this is what happens when a big event like Northern Rock happens. Here's all the stages that you're going to go through when you're covering it. You play them videos of what happened at the time, and they're like, oh wow, did this happen? It's like, yeah, you know.
Yeah. All right, great. Thank you. So what happens after that job?
So the credit crisis came,
Hmm.
and I was headhunted from there to join Incisive Business Media, or Incisive Media as it was, for a title called Mortgage Solutions, to be their editor. I had the contract in my hand. I was like, great, it's brilliant. They said I'm going to be the new editor. Told all my contacts I'm going to be the new editor of this title. Credit crisis is playing out in the background, and I'm, having some gardening leave, so I don't know what's happening. I get a phone call about 4 weeks later. I'm due to start the following week. I'm really sorry, but we're triggering the severance clause in your contract due to macro events. There is no job for you anymore, and we're laying off some of our staff. Oh, so I don't have a job anymore. So I thought, okay, I'll go back to my old boss because, did a
Yeah.
good job there. They haven't hired anyone yet. Phone up the MD of my old company and say, hi, look, it hasn't worked out where I'm going. Can I stay? And he turns around and said, I'm really sorry. We've just had notification from one of our key sponsors that they're not going to honour a contract because they've gone bust. And as a result, we're insolvent as well. So that company disappears too. Suddenly I'm jobless. I've gone from having a great job where I've been headhunted to nothing at all.
Yeah.
And I go on the job hunt, and the first thing I look at is FT Business again. And I'm like, okay, well, let's take a step back. There's no mortgage jobs being advertised because, well,
No.
the economy's in the toilet, and that market's been decimated. So what can I turn my hand to? Well, I used to cover retail on the IFA beat. Maybe I can look at investment. So I get in touch with the then editor of Money Management, Janet Walford, and I apply. And next thing I know, I'm back at FT Business as the deputy editor of Money Management.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what happens in that role? How long are you there for, and what kind of work are you doing there?
So again, we're back to money again. So I just got my earnings up to, I think, let's go back salary wise now. I won't talk about numbers in each one, but they've gone up quite well now. I've
Yeah.
jumped probably about 15 grand. I mean, we're still not earning the same as what you would have been earning if you were in house somewhere for a bank or an asset manager, but I'm starting to get to
Yeah.
what would have been the entry level for a graduate scheme on one of the newspapers. So I thought, okay, right, get this new job. But because of what's happened to the economy, all of the salaries are cut again. So I lose about 10 grand off my salary again. And I'm like, well, at least it's a job. I can pay my rent. So I get my head down, and the role is dual pronged, which means that I can do a bit of news for the website, which is great because I can still put out some mortgage stuff that I'm getting fed from my contacts, but also I'm getting to write about life, pensions, investments, which is the stuff that I've not covered for a few years. But it would soon become clear that those contacts are going to lead me into an entirely new part of my career, and they prove to be very, very useful. And as I start to write increasingly about investment, and that's where things take a bit of a turn.
Yeah. And is that when you is that when you go to financial news, or is that when you transition to your own
No,
business?
there's a stop in
There's more.
between.
Okay.
So again, because you've got to remember, I'm now, well, how old am I now? I'm probably 28, and I'm still carrying loads of debt. And I'm like, I can't afford to. I need more money.
Yeah.
And again, all the HR handbooks make me laugh because I don't know who they're written by, but it's always like, oh, well, if it comes down to money, ultimately there's other things they're unhappy with. Money is always the last thing that people leave. Trust me, when you haven't got any, it's the first thing that you're going to think of when you're going to leave. So, I say rubbish to these people who tell you that that's the case. I appreciate for people in other positions maybe, but if you have none and you're in debt, it's the primary concern. So, so off I go, on the lookout again, try to get on the FT newspaper, doesn't happen. And so I apply for the editorship of What Investment. And that, again, allows me to spread my wings a little bit with what I know about investments and build some fantastic contacts in the investment world. And that does set me up for moving on to financial news at Dow Jones.
Yeah. And how long are you there for at financial news?
Again, probably, how long was I at Financial News for? So again, about a year and a half. And I remember sitting across from Mike Foster, who is one of the very senior founders of Financial News, who decided to carry on as a journalist. And I remember telling him after 18 months, yeah, I'm gonna leave again. He's like, your CV, it's a weird CV. And I was trying to explain to him the reasons for each move. But again, I got headhunted to go somewhere else. More money was put on the table. I was still looking for money, but wanting to stay as a journalist. And it's beginning to get more difficult now because journalist salaries are capped at a level. But I left again. And again, if we're talking about HR practice, so I remember being told at the time by my bosses there is no more money. I had my review. We think you're great. You're scoring really high on everything. Thank you for your work, but there is no more money. And then I resigned, and it was like, oh, we spoke to New York. There's more money now. It's like, well, I've already signed a contract. I've got to go somewhere else. It's like, come on. I would have loved to have stayed there. It was a fantastic employer in terms of the standard of journalism, the quality of what they teach, second to none. Like their ethics, their the induction process was, I think it was about 2 weeks of just meeting journalists who were incredibly seasoned, thoughtful, respectful, ethically competent, global in their outlook. It was one of the, I think it's probably the newsroom that I've taken the most from. Dow Jones was a truly remarkable employer in every way.
Yeah. It's really interesting talking about the moves, and I think it almost your moves were for money, okay, because of your circumstances. But I think it's really interesting when you are in the HR department and you are reviewing applications, you are often put off by people who haven't stayed very long in an organization. So it's really tough, isn't it? Because you've got to do something, because you've got to pay your bills. So, you had to make those moves. But I hate to say it, in some ways they could have put people off. Maybe not so much in journalism, because I guess there are lots of freelancers, and so perhaps the tenure in each organisation is shorter. But it could have been, rightly or wrongly, off-putting for an employer.
Oh, Joe, I can tell you now, there were circumstances where it definitely did put people off, where I decided I needed to move on because of the money and wasn't going to go up. I'd had letters back explicitly stating that's the case. I'm sorry, but there's been too many moves on your CV. Because when I'd ask for feedback, they'd tell me, what am I supposed to do? Like, I can't get an organisation to lift me up the ladder, but equally I need to earn more money because otherwise I'm going to be carrying this debt forever. It was very, very hard, very hard. And again, it's I think it's just one of those things you have to accept. I think it's just it was the circumstance at the time.
Yeah, and I think the example you gave of the money not having the money, sorry, the organisation not having the money and then having the money, that does happen time and time again, unfortunately. But short-sighted, I think, would be what I'd say there. So
I don't know. Some people would say fair enough.
Okay, so now you're Financial News, and then did you say there's a stop in between that and your own business, or are we now at Rotic Media?
Yeah, so after that, I went to a sort of a small trade who didn't disclose when they were headhunting me that they were going through a buyout themselves. What happened with that was you land what you were told, oh, we're going to get together all the best journalists in the country. And there were some great journalists that were there when I arrived, only for the new buyer to come in literally like 6 weeks later and say, hi, I'm the new buyer. We don't want to be a media company. Yeah, like, oh, okay. You've just hired a load of journalists. No, our predecessors do that. And then they proceed to basically turn it into something else. And it's like, okay, well, my skill set is this. So either redundancy, please, or we do what you've hired me to do. Anyway, things don't work out for the journalists working in that business, and we all go our separate ways. the good news is I end up one last stop before Rotic, which is at the Euromoney institutional investor group of companies, which is now called something else. But again, it was yet another example of where you're really encouraged to produce great work. And it was the perfect setup to launching Rotic, because you were really pushed to produce fantastic editorial. At Institutional Investor, I'm really proud to have been among the last European pool of journalists in the editorial floor before they closed everything down, because some of the pieces there were top notch.
Thank you. So tell us about the decision to set up on your own and go it alone.
So Euromoney had decided they didn't have appetite for Institutional Investor for its editorial operations in Europe and Asia. And as a result, they sort of re-engineered what was doing what and spent big in America. And they sort of retrenched what they were doing editorially and with editorial sales in Europe and Asia. So I was like, do I want to start applying for things again and justifying why I'm worth what I'm worth? But equally, we've got all these hops on my CV now, and people are looking at it going, oh, come on, really? You're going to stay here 5 minutes? So I just got it to the stage where I was like, do you know what? I've always wanted to be my own boss. I think I've got enough career experience now. I'm just going to give it a go. And so I was sitting in an interview for someone else, actually, and sitting there. And halfway through the interview, I just stopped listening and was like, no, I don't need to be here. I'm going to do this. I don't want this job. I'm going to run my own company. And that was it. And the decision just happened like that. There you go.
Yeah. And it was obviously the right decision because you're still here 5 years later.
Well, I'm still here. No, I absolutely love my job. As I say, I'm very, very lucky, and I'm very lucky to have been joined by so many talented people. Like we really do have, we just have the best journalists in the market. I keep saying it time and time again. We are so lucky that little old us has become a magnet for the best talent in the industry. And it's a joy to come to work every day. I love it. I absolutely love it. And I encourage other people to do the same. If you've got the ability to stay awake very late and give up your weekends and have understanding partners, go and do it.
Just on that, Joe, before we move on, I'm really we talk about diversity in the industry, and I'm curious about how gender plays out when it comes to the early mornings, the late nights, the weekends. I'm just curious if that means that, and actually I guess it should be a question for both men and women, but I think that largely these responsibilities impact women, and so I'm wondering how that plays out in their ability to be successful in this industry, if that is a requirement.
Oh, that's a big question. I mean, I have to say, hand on heart, my wife, who also is a professional in a director position working within corporate comms in the City of London, is incredibly accommodative with when there's something big going on at Rotic. She will move mountains to help. And that can be really hard. We've got a 4-year-old, and the company's 5 years old, so that was running simultaneously. But we've sort of locked down a schedule, if you like, for when things are relatively normal, and it means that first 2 days of the week are my time if I need to work late or go in early. Wednesdays and Thursdays are her days. If she needs to network in the evening, she needs to work late. It's no questions asked. I do the pickups, and vice versa with her on Monday and Tuesdays. And then Friday tends to be her day, either working working from home or looking after Tom. I'm a bit sort of blurred on that bit because he's about to start school soon, so that's going to change the dynamic. But we've had to be quite methodical about it, and it means that people say, "Oh, you don't see each other very much." Well, no, we don't, and it's the trade-off in the short term. But it means that
Yeah.
Friday nights are our time together. Friday nights are absolutely sacred, and equally, Saturday afternoons, Sunday afternoons are family time.
Yeah.
But there's a lot to juggle, and I think
Yeah.
it's not just women with families either. People have other commitments,
Yeah.
and it's not just men that have children or partners. I think we need to get to a place where, as organisations, we have an understanding that people shouldn't have to demand a personal life. It is just part of living, and we have to find a way to accommodate that slightly better. And appreciate that there is a balance that needs to be struck between setting boundaries for what you need delivered, but also setting boundaries for what the organisation will accept and what they should be encouraged to do to help colleagues actually have the life that they need to have.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, Joe, when you look back at your career journey, from those work experiences to now, what's been the high of the journey?
What's been the high of the journey? I honestly think it's probably being in a position to issue contracts to young people. I know that sounds really silly because it's not a moment, but I don't know what I thought would be the buzz that I got from running a business. I didn't think it would necessarily be that. It's something I wanted to do. But being able to create a job to offer employment
Yeah.
is possibly the most fulfilling thing in the world. There was not a job. You've created however many. When you're a bootstrap business, it's not investors that have created it. You've literally created the need. You've created the work.
Yeah.
You've created the job, and that's paying someone's mortgage, or it's paying their development, or it's hugely empowering. And probably, well, it's not probably about it. It's bigger than any buzz from breaking a story or getting access to something. It's enormous. Truthfully,
Yeah.
it's the thing that drives me to continue wanting to do it.
Yeah. Thank you. What about, again, looking back on the career journey, what's been the biggest challenge or failure or limiting belief you've had to overcome?
Ooh, I think it probably at the early days of starting off, the number of rejections. It would be very easy to be dispirited in the old days when people used to write to you, by post. Just having the delivery of when people did respond, of numerous letters on the doorstep saying no, 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 and then having to go back to the library to have a look at emailing people your CV out again. It's just it was horribly relentless, and very easily could have discouraged me from being in the market at all. I could have ended up doing something entirely different.
Yeah. And for anybody who is perhaps going through an application process right now and is getting rejections and starting to feel, dispirited, what advice would you give to them to, stick with it?
I think you need to assess how wedded are you to the industry and sector that you're applying for. If it's something that you feel and in your stomach that you really, really want to do, and you've done sufficient amount of research to know that's what I want, you just have to grit your teeth together and keep again going again and again and again and again, and eventually someone will find you and that door will open, and as soon as it does, everything moves very, very quickly from that point forward.
Yeah, thank you. Joe, you've shared quite a lot about how you're employing young people, and I'm guessing you're a great role model and mentor to them. I'm wondering how role models and mentors, sponsors and so on have impacted your journey.
Yeah, there's been so many people in industry that I probably couldn't name check them all here. Editors who've given me confidence to be bold. There's been places I've had to go where there was a degree of physical risk, which you might not expect in financial services. I remember writing about companies that have gone insolvent and lost people money, where I'd had to knock on someone's door and they threatened all sorts. Um, you know, and the editors have sort of coached me as to the best way to do that. I've had people who have not been my direct manager but have been champions for me in the industry where, certainly when I was a younger reporter, people would say, oh, well, he's very difficult to deal with. And my supporters would hit back with, no, he's just got a strong moral compass and he's serving the people he's been told to serve. And those sort of gentle supporters on the sidelines are probably worth an awful lot more than they know, because when you're a journalist and sometimes you're asking difficult questions, it can be it can quickly snowball that sort of sentiment that you're just difficult to work with. Luckily many of those people have become my clients now, so I don't know. There's so many people that I would like to name, and editors particularly. But there will always be someone in your network who will help you.
Yeah. Thank you. As we move on to advice for people who are keen to, find out more or think this is the industry for them, we've already talked about education, but I'm wondering what softer skills or non-technical skills you feel are essential for a budding journalist?
I think you've got to be able to drink in a lot of information and step back from it once you've collated it and try and pull out what the overarching trend is. You need to have ability to evaluate bias. You need to have ability to say no to people in some instances where it's much easier to say yes. Try to be, if you're working in a particular part of editorial where, being morally correct matters, I think sometimes that can manifest with conflict, and just being strong and saying, explaining, look, I know this is your perspective, but the reason I have to cover it like this is X. And I think looking back, perhaps I wasn't as articulate as I could have been on that part. It would have served me better perhaps to have explained myself a bit more rather than getting frustrated, which was often the case. I think the writing ability will come. That can be coached, but you've got to have the ability to structure a narrative from the information that you've gathered from the interviews that you've done, and be able to sort of sift through the bias that's there as well.
Yeah. Any other soft skills that you feel are important?
That's about it. I think, it's an industry that there's no type of person that will necessarily prevail over another. There are introverts, there are extroverts. We've got all sorts in journalism. It's wonderful. And there's a different role in the newsroom for each individual. So it's really hard to sort of pick a type.
Yeah, well, that's good. That's a good thing.
I think so too.
Yeah. So, what does the future hold for journalism and content and media?
I think there's obviously going to be more, but I think we're going to have this separation of original quality content, whether that's editorial or corporate, and then we're going to have the repurposed and collated. And in between that, you'll have levels of technical sophistication as well. And I think this quality end will be where those values of being able to evaluate bias, being able to work with source material, being able to conduct interviews, and all the other stuff with original sourcing that I was saying are important to be a journalist. I think that will continue to be very, very important at the top end. I think the skills down at the bottom end are probably closer aligned to SEO and influencer marketing, which is a slightly different skill set.
Yeah. And do you think there'll always be a place for print media?
Always. I don't know about always. I think at the moment there certainly is. People are incredibly time poor these days. And the reason that the good quality print works, particularly like high production value magazines, is that if you've got a magazine full of unique material, people can just leave it and come back to it and pick it up. They don't have to open up and log into something, or they've seen something, I'll read it later, and they never come back to it. It's just there as a reference point. I don't think it's unique in that it will stand on its own. I think it's part of the multimedia environment that we operate in, that we all know and love. But I do at the moment, I think very much there is a role for print, yes.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. So for anyone that wants to find out more about journalism as a career, where would you point them? Do you have any online resources or anywhere that you might suggest they go take a look?
Sure. Yes.
Or print?
I think it's worth. I think it's worth looking at the National Council for the Training of Journalists for sure. But also, if you're looking at content, have a look at the work that the Content Marketing Association does as well. I think some of the degree apprenticeship standards that are offered now for those looking to get in for the first time are worth exploring. You've got everything from digital marketing, of which content is one of the subject areas they look at. And then you've also got various other professional standards relating to journalism as well, which I think there are apprenticeships that are mapped to those as well. There's loads of places you can look at, but again, I think the NCTJ and the various content marketing associations are not a bad place to start.
Okay, thank you. All right, Joe, as we move towards wrapping up, what do you know now that you wished you'd known when you were just starting out?
That's a massive question. There's too many things to name. I think that that people are. It's very difficult to truly understand all aspects of an individual, even when you've known them for a couple of years. I think relationships are incredibly valuable because they're incredibly complicated, and they require work. And I don't mean that in terms of it being a massive frustration, but you really have to continue to work with someone and to understand them as they change as well. And I think contact building and networking requires some time, and it's worth investing.
And what would you say to Joe, who was heading into that newsroom for the first time, or finishing uni and not being able to get that first job?
Don't worry too much about the finances. That'll come. Just keep focused on the job. That's it sounds very basic given what we've discussed, but it occupied a lot of my time for a long time.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting is in the last couple of years, I've done quite a lot of work around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I worked really closely with an organisation called Investment 2020, who I love. And one of the things that we talk about is bringing your whole self to work. And for a variety of reasons, people might not bring their whole self to work. And not bringing your whole self to work consumes mental energy. So if you're not able to bring your whole self to work because you're worried about how you're going to pay the bills, then your employer's not getting the best out of you. I guess that's why it's so important, isn't it? That, you know, we've got to make it easy for people to come to work and do their best work.
Yeah, but I think, you look at this holistically from a strategic perspective as an employer, that consideration has to be interwoven to the resourcing more broadly, and there needs to be a set of KPIs that are there which validate what you've just said, which is, why would I pay them more? Well, here is what happens when you do pay them more. Or here is what happens in terms of staff retention when there's an automatic pay rise at this point, or when they achieve X. And it's just, having the cheapest possible labour because you can get away with it, I think that's outdated, and we need to move on from there.
Yeah, thank you. Joe, I really like quotes, inspirational words of wisdom and so on. And I'm wondering if you have anything you could share with the audience, that something that that you feel that works for you.
Do you know what? One of my lecturers on my MBA gave me something the other day, and I can't remember what it was. I'm really sorry, but it was a brilliant quote. Because I was doing some sort of presentation to some graduates at one of the colleges I used to study at, and I was asking what was the best thing you've ever been told. So instead of that one, I will give you another one that I was told at my graduation, which I still think is brilliant, particularly for anyone who wants to be an entrepreneur, which was, if you think the grass is greener on the other side, water your own grass.
Okay. That's a good one.
There you go.
Thank you.
I don't know I don't know how good that is, but
And you can email me the one you've forgotten, so we can add it into the show notes. How about that?
Sure, I am. I'm gonna have to ask her now and say, I'm really sorry, Steph. I've forgotten what it was that you told me.
Joe, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us today. I feel super inspired. I've learnt loads, and I hope the audience will too. Is there anything that you'd like to leave the audience with before we go?
No, I think I've literally given you as much as I can. But I'd love to speak again on many of these issues. So if anyone feels the need to sort of pick up anything that I've said and explore it further, I'm more than happy to have a discussion. So drop me an email.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you, Joe.
All right, Joe. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining Joe and I on the show today. We really hope you enjoyed it. If you gained any value out of this episode, please share it with your friends and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you have any questions, comments or suggestions, do get in touch with us. We are always happy to help. So we'll see you next time. And in the meantime, have a great week. Thanks so much for tuning in.